Mistakes are a part of human nature. No one can escape them. But in the cockpit, those mistakes, they can have grave, life-altering consequences. And yet, aviation has designed countless strategies to prevent such errors. We've put systems in place, protocols to ensure safety, and a structure meant to catch even the smallest slip-up. But what happens when nearly everything conspires against these strategies? What happens when pilots are left with just a few seconds to act, and they have no idea what's truly happening? Stay tuned. The summer of 2007 was a time of unprecedented pressure for Brazil's aviation industry. Demand for air travel had been climbing steadily, around 15% per year for several years. But then came a critical blow. Brazil's largest airline, Varig, shut down. The void it left was massive, and airlines scrambled to fill the gap. But there was a significant issue. Brazil's airport infrastructure was outdated, unable to keep pace with the soaring demand. Control towers were understaffed, and airports were overburdened. By July 2007, over half of Brazil's flights were delayed, causing frustration not just for passengers, but for the pilots who had to deal with it on the front lines. One airline, TAM Airlines, had become the largest in the country and was feeling the strain. The airline had rapidly expanded in the last few years, doubling its fleet and hiring thousands of new pilots, pushing them through training as quickly as possible to meet the demand. Yet these pilots now had to endure a constant barrage of delays, congested airspace, and angry passengers, many of whom were disruptive or even violent. One policy that made things worse? A new rule that required pilots to step out of the cockpit during boarding to greet passengers. This might seem like a small thing, but it added more stress. The pilots were exposed to the passengers' frustrations and anger, and the added time spent outside the cockpit delayed the pre-flight checks and paperwork even further, making the delays worse. Despite this growing tension, TAM Airlines offered no substantial support for the crews. In fact, the airline only employed one aviation psychologist to support over 5,000 pilots. But for the pilots involved in today's story, stress was just the tip of the iceberg. On the evening of July 17, 2007, two TAM pilots arrived in Porto Alegre, a southern Brazilian city, after a short domestic flight from São Paulo. They had barely touched down, parked the aircraft, and immediately began preparing for the return flight to São Paulo. The aircraft was a 9-year-old Airbus A320. It wasn't exactly in top condition, but we'll circle back to that in a moment. The captain in charge, a 53-year-old experienced pilot, had accumulated over 13,600 flying hours in total, with more than 2,200 hours on the Airbus A320. His colleagues regarded him as diligent, meticulous about reading manuals, and committed to understanding every procedure in detail. However, under pressure, he was known to be a bit slow in his decision-making. His first officer was another seasoned captain, 54 years old, with over 14,700 flight hours, though only 237 of those hours were on the A320. Despite his vast experience, he had only recently transitioned to the A320, having been hired just a few months earlier. You might be wondering, why was there a second captain in the cockpit instead of a typical first officer? This isn't common practice, but it does happen from time to time. However, it wasn't by design. The rapid expansion of TAM Airlines had caused a disconnect between their hiring, scheduling, and training departments, resulting in more captains than first officers. As a result, the airline often found itself scheduling flights with two captains in the cockpit. While some pilots enjoy flying alongside another captain, it introduces its own set of challenges. Each captain has their own style of command, and giving orders to another captain can be awkward. Clear communication before the flight is crucial to establish who's in charge. But these pilots hadn't received formal training for such a setup. What they had, however, was a right seat check, a brief review done annually to ensure pilots can handle the role of first officer from the right seat. But this minimal training did not address the real challenges of CRM, cockpit resource management, that might arise when two captains are in the cockpit together. And the challenges didn't stop there. TAM Airlines had rushed its pilots through training programs to convert the fleet from the Fokker 100 to the Airbus A320. While they offered more theoretical training than recommended by Airbus, practical cockpit training was far below standards. Airbus recommended 40 hours of cockpit training. TAM provided only 12. Similarly, simulator training was 7 hours short of what was required. These shortfalls increased the background risks for pilots, especially in a high-pressure environment. But on that fateful day, the stress kept building. When the pilots first boarded the aircraft that day, they discovered that one of the thrust reversers on the A320 was inoperative. This was just the beginning of the trouble. In aviation, the thrust reverser is a crucial part of slowing down the aircraft after landing. It redirects engine thrust forward, providing an additional means of decelerating the aircraft. A malfunction here wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a significant safety concern, particularly when the aircraft was already operating under stressful conditions. In this moment, what seemed like a routine flight was becoming a pressure cooker, where every minor issue and oversight stacked up to create a perfect storm. The thrust reversers on an aircraft are critical components designed to help slow the aircraft down after landing or during a rejected takeoff. On the Airbus A320, which was powered by the IAE V2500 engines, these thrust reversers work by deploying blocking doors that direct bypass air forward instead of backwards. This redirection of airflow helps decelerate the plane, though it's only a small part of the total braking force needed to stop the aircraft. Typically, thrust reversers aren't necessary for takeoff or landing, provided the plane is otherwise in good working order. However, when an aircraft has a malfunctioning thrust reverser, the situation can become more complicated. For the TAM Airlines flight in question, the issue had started days earlier. The aircraft's right-hand thrust reverser had suffered a malfunction, and while maintenance crews had tried to fix it, they hadn't been able to. So, they simply deactivated the malfunctioning system and recorded it in the aircraft's technical log. When the pilots picked up the plane, they noticed the issue and consulted the Minimum Equipment List, MEL, a document that outlines which systems can be inoperative during flight and the necessary procedures for handling such situations. According to the MEL, landing with one thrust reverser inoperative was permissible as long as the other systems were functioning properly. In this case, the pilots had followed the proper procedure on their first leg of the journey, flying from São Paulo to Porto Alegre. The flight went smoothly, with the captain only needing to apply a bit of extra rudder to compensate for the slight asymmetry caused by the inoperative thrust reverser. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable, and they were able to land without issue. But their next flight was going to be a different story altogether. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 was scheduled to return to São Paulo's Congonhas Airport, a location notorious for its tricky and, at times, dangerous conditions. Congonhas Airport, located in the heart of São Paulo, is the busiest airport in Brazil and serves as the primary domestic hub for the city. While it plays a critical role in the country's aviation network, it is far from an ideal airport for large aircraft. The runway at Congonhas is just 1,145 meters long, short by modern standards for larger airliners. And the airport's location in the middle of the city means there's no room for expansion, leading to congestion and delays. By 2007, this was a key contributor to systemic flight delays across Brazil. But beyond the operational challenges, Congonhas presented a real threat to pilots, especially when it came to landings. The main runway, 35L17R, lacked proper runway safety areas, RSAs, leaving it dangerously close to steep embankments and busy city streets. The risk of overrunning the runway was significant. In fact, just a few meters beyond the runway's end could mean a catastrophic outcome. This made landing at Congonhas not only inconvenient, but potentially perilous. So, as the TAM flight prepared to return to São Paulo, the stress on the pilots intensified. With a malfunctioning thrust reverser, a crowded airspace, and the challenging landing conditions at Congonhas, the situation was becoming increasingly precarious. But the story doesn't end there. As we continue, we'll see how these mounting pressures would soon culminate in a life-or-death moment for the crew. This scenario isn't unique in aviation. There are similar instances where a combination of mechanical failure, human error, and environmental factors converge to create a perfect storm of risk. A case worth considering is the tragic accident of Avianca Flight 52 in 1990. Like the TAM incident, Avianca Flight 52 involved a series of miscommunications and mechanical failures. The crew was pushed to the limits as they struggled to manage their resources while landing at a congested airport under deteriorating conditions. Both incidents remind us that even the most seasoned pilots are not immune to the pressure of managing a complex system under stress. The technical components, while designed to protect, can also be the source of an unanticipated crisis, just as the malfunctioning thrust reverser would soon prove to be. But before we move forward, let's take a moment to reflect on how the right tools and proper support could have made all the difference. Having the necessary systems, proper training, and well-coordinated procedures in place isn't just important. It's essential to preventing the worst outcomes. Up until the events of this story, Congonhas Airport had never experienced a serious, overrun accident, but many pilots had long believed it was only a matter of time. The airport's runway, while vital to São Paulo's aviation infrastructure, was fraught with risks, primarily because of its short length and lack of safety margins. But there was an even greater danger lurking beneath the surface. The runway itself was poorly surfaced and prone to becoming dangerously slippery when wet, a frequent occurrence in the area. Airport authorities had tried various methods to mitigate these risks. They deployed special equipment to remove rubber buildup from the surface and tested different surface additives to improve traction. But none of these measures had been effective. Water still accumulated in puddles, making the runway treacherously slick after even light rainfall. By May 2007, the airport had closed runway 35L-17R for resurfacing, hoping to address the friction problem once and for all. The best solution would have been to carve grooves into the runway, allowing water to drain off while maintaining optimal contact between the aircraft tires and the ridged surface. This would help avoid dangerous standing water. However, despite nearing the project's completion, these grooves had not yet been carved. Despite this, the airport decided to reopen the runway on June 29, 2007, with plans to complete the groove installation at an unspecified later date. This decision was made without input from Brazil's Civil Aviation Authority, ANAC. In fact, the entire resurfacing project had not even received ANAC's approval. This lack of regulatory oversight, coupled with ANAC's slow action on even basic safety tasks, only served to reinforce the growing concern among pilots about the safety of Congonhas Airport. It seemed that little was being done to address the dangers. To make matters worse, ANAC had drafted a regulation back in 2006 that would require all passenger jets landing at Congonhas to have both thrust reversers operational. However, despite the rule being in place, it was never fully implemented. This oversight would soon have terrifying consequences. Meanwhile, at TAM Airlines, Flight 3554 was preparing for departure. After completing the paperwork, greeting passengers, and performing the required turnaround checks, the pilots made their final calculations. With the aircraft fully booked, the total weight of the plane was 66.9 tons, including 2.4 tons of extra fuel, as the airline had a policy of fueling up in Porto Alegre, where fuel costs were cheaper. The weight on landing at Congonhas would be about 63.5 tons, just 1 ton below the maximum landing weight for the airport under the reported weather conditions. However, The weather conditions themselves were far from ideal. The weather report indicated light rain, variable cloud ceilings between 800 and 1,600 feet, visibility ranging from 6,000 to 8,000 meters, and winds of 8 to 12 knots coming from the north. Fortunately, aligned with the runway's orientation. While the weather was not at minimums, it was enough to make the runway slippery. With this information in mind, the pilots pushed back from the gate at 17:19, receiving takeoff clearance for a 19-hour arrival in São Paulo. The takeoff itself went smoothly, but just after becoming airborne, the crew received word from departure control that Congonhas Airport had temporarily closed due to the wet runway conditions. By the time they received this message, however, the airport had already reopened, having been closed only briefly for a runway friction check. Although the pilots were informed that the airport was now open, this brief closure likely reinforced their concerns about the situation. Just the day before, an ATR-42 from another airline had hydroplaned on landing at Congonhas, sliding off the runway, striking a light pole, and causing the nose gear to collapse. Though there were no serious injuries in that incident, the aircraft was so badly damaged that it was eventually written off. What made this even more concerning was that the ATR had encountered this problem with only light rain reported on the runway surface, something the TAM pilots were likely aware of. As Flight 3054 neared São Paulo, the crew would have been acutely aware of the potential dangers posed by the still wet, ungrouped runway. The combination of a malfunctioning thrust reverser, a slippery runway, and the inherent challenges of landing at Congonhas had created a high-risk scenario that only increased as the aircraft approached. And with every passing minute, the pressure on the pilots continued to build. This scenario highlights the critical importance of addressing multiple layers of risk in aviation, be it from mechanical failures, environmental conditions, or the infrastructure itself. When any of these factors are left unchecked or poorly managed, the results can be disastrous. What might seem like a manageable issue, such as a single thrust reverser malfunction, can quickly escalate into a full-blown crisis when combined with other contributing factors. Just as the pilots of Flight 3054 were about to find out, even the smallest oversight can lead to catastrophic consequences. As TAM Airlines Flight 3054 continued its climb toward its cruising altitude of 21,000 feet, the crew encountered rough weather conditions with moderate to occasionally severe turbulence. The pilots were forced to request route modifications twice as they navigated through building thunderstorms. These challenges undoubtedly increased their workload, requiring them to stay sharp as they continued their journey toward São Paulo. At 18:03, the pilots received the news that Congonhas Airport had reopened. This wasn't particularly surprising, as the airport had a reputation for frequent start and stop operations due to weather conditions. Despite the brief closure, pilots were accustomed to hearing about these temporary closures and were generally less inclined to consider diversions unless the conditions were absolutely severe. At the time, many pilots felt an implicit pressure from airline management to avoid diversions, as diverting a flight could damage the airline's reputation and increase operational costs. As the flight neared its destination, the pilots began their descent and approach briefing. They reviewed the essential elements for landing, such as landing distance calculations, procedures, and the specific threats they might face. Unfortunately, the cockpit voice recorder on this flight only recorded the final 30 minutes of the journey, meaning the earlier parts of the briefing weren't captured. While we can't know exactly what was covered, we do have clues about what was discussed when the recording started. For instance, the captain asked the acting first officer to verify the conditions at Congonhas. This was especially important, given that the aircraft was landing with one thrust reverser inoperative. The captain also mentioned that he had a slight headache, which, under such stressful circumstances, could be understandable. Headaches are a common physical reaction to high levels of stress. Despite the captain's discomfort, the rest of the flight proceeded as planned. Flight 354 received vectors for the ILS approach to runway 35L, with the captain in command of the flight and the acting first officer performing the monitoring duties. It made sense for the captain to be flying the approach, as he was more experienced with the aircraft and was seated in the left seat, his usual position. Meanwhile, the acting first officer, less experienced on the A320 and seated in the right seat, would have had a significantly lower workload and would be tasked with monitoring and identifying any potential mistakes. As the aircraft approached the runway, it was quickly stabilized on speed and glide slope, with the proper configuration in place and all checklists completed. Everything appeared to be progressing according to plan. However, the captain's nervousness became more apparent when he again asked the first officer to verify the runway conditions. This time, the response was that the runway was wet and slippery. The captain, clearly displeased with this information, read it back to his colleague in a tone that indicated frustration. He knew that these conditions mirrored those of the day before, when a similar wet runway had led to an incident involving an ATR-42 aircraft that had hydroplaned and slid off the runway. Though there had been no serious injuries, the plane had been damaged beyond repair. The captain was undoubtedly aware of this incident and recognized that landing in similar conditions would be risky. At this point, it seems the captain made a fateful decision, one born from experience, but ultimately leading to tragic consequences. The captain, with over 2,000 hours on the A320, had likely landed with an inoperative thrust reverser multiple times before. However, when he had done so in the past, he would have used a different landing procedure. Before January 2007, Airbus had specified a procedure for landing with one thrust reverser. The crew would pull both thrust levers to idle just before touching down and then engage the reverser on the side of the engine with the operational thrust reverser. However, this procedure was prone to errors, too. In 3 separate accidents between 1998 and 2004, the need to adjust only one thrust lever led to the crew inadvertently leaving the other thrust lever in the forward thrust position, a mistake that contributed to accidents, including one fatal crash in the Philippines. In response to these accidents, Airbus revised the procedure in January 2007 to make it more straightforward. Instead of splitting the thrust levers, the updated procedure now required both levers to be pulled to idle first, and then to reverse simultaneously, much like a standard landing with 2 operational thrust reversers. This change was incorporated into the TAM Airlines Minimum Equipment List, MEL, which the captain had reviewed before the flight. However, there was a catch. The thrust reversers, though crucial for deceleration, were often not considered part of the official landing distance calculations. Some airlines even excluded them from the landing distance estimates altogether, meaning the calculated distance to land was always shorter than the actual distance required in the event that the reversers were inoperative. This procedural change, combined with a failure to properly account for the thrust reverser's absence in the landing calculations, set the stage for a dangerous decision. The captain, relying on a procedure that had changed only months earlier, might have believed that the landing with one thrust reverser would be manageable, without fully appreciating the significant risks posed by the wet and slippery runway. What seemed like a manageable issue, a slight malfunction of a single thrust reverser, was about to escalate into something far more perilous. As the flight neared its critical moments, the pilots were unaware that the combination of a malfunctioning thrust reverser, a slippery runway, and other mounting pressures would soon lead to tragedy. In aviation, there's often a cushion of safety built into landing distance calculations. These factors account for typical conditions like dry runways and properly functioning equipment. But when the runway is wet and slippery, that cushion is significantly reduced. The reason? When the runway is slick, wheel brakes become less effective and thrust reversers must take on a larger role in stopping the aircraft. This means that a malfunctioning thrust reverser increases the required landing distance significantly. If one thrust reverser is inoperative and the aircraft is landing on a contaminated runway, The landing distance needs to be recalculated to account for the reduced braking efficiency. Under the updated Airbus procedure, introduced in January 2007, the distance required for landing with one thrust reverser inoperative was increased by 55 meters. This change was based on the design of the Airbus A320's electronic engine control (EEC) system. Here's the issue. When a thrust lever is moved into the reverse detent, it commands an increase in engine thrust, specifically to produce reverse thrust. But if the reverse thrust doors fail to deploy properly, the engine instead generates forward thrust, even though the lever is in the reverse position. When the EEC detects this discrepancy, it quickly locks the engine's thrust to idle. However, this delay in thrust adjustment temporarily produces more forward thrust, increasing the required landing distance by 55 meters. This update was a direct response to previous accidents where the old procedure, which required moving only one thrust lever into reverse, led to confusion and tragic consequences. But for the captain of Flight 3054, who had spent much of his career using the old procedure, the change was significant. He would have known that using the new procedure would require adding 55 meters to the landing distance. Given the already risky runway conditions and his concerns about the landing, it's likely that he decided to use the old procedure to save those 55 meters. However, while this may have seemed like a small thing, it had far-reaching consequences. Here's the key point. Even with one thrust reverser inoperative and the wet runway, the calculated landing distance was still only 1,332 meters, well within the 1,1945 meters available at Congonhas. In other words, there was no real danger of overrunning the runway. But the captain, perhaps overwhelmed by the stress and concerned about the possible consequences of overrunning the runway, may have misjudged the situation. If he had overrun by just 55 meters, the aircraft would have plunged down an embankment and onto a busy street. The captain might have been thinking, "If I don't save those 55 meters, I will deeply regret it if something goes wrong." But in retrospect, this decision to use the old procedure was a critical error. The procedure had been updated due to several fatal accidents that occurred when pilots made similar mistakes, leaving one thrust lever in the wrong position. These incidents were not hypothetical. They had cost lives. Unfortunately, it seems that the captain wasn't aware of these past accidents, as TAM Airlines had not shared information about other airlines' incidents during recurrent training sessions for their A320 pilots. The failure to adhere to standard operating procedures wasn't unique to this flight. The flight data recorder revealed that at least 5 different techniques had been used on previous flights to deal with the same issue: landing with one thrust reverser inoperative. This highlighted a broader problem within TAM Airlines, where a lack of standardization in procedures was leading to inconsistent practices among the flight crews. Given this environment, the prudent course of action would have been for the captain to brief the risks associated with using the old procedure and make sure both pilots were clear on the actions they needed to take. However, there was no indication of such a briefing in the cockpit voice recorder, even though the captain did briefly remind the acting first officer that they were landing with one thrust reverser inoperative. But he didn't clarify what that meant in terms of specific actions or what to be mindful of during the landing. This lack of situational awareness, coupled with the elevated stress the pilots were undoubtedly under, set the stage for human error. At 1854, TAM Airlines Flight 3054 passed the threshold of runway 35L, fully configured and ready to land. But the conditions and decisions made in the cockpit would soon push the aircraft into a situation that no one was fully prepared for. The runway, the weather, the equipment, and the choices made all converged in a way that would soon lead to tragic consequences. As Flight 3054 approached the runway, the aircraft was fully configured for landing, with both the flaps and landing gear extended. This created significant drag on the aircraft, requiring the engines to produce a substantial amount of power to maintain the proper approach speed. On the Airbus A320, when the engines are engaged, the thrust lever position doesn't directly show the pilots the engine's power output, unlike on other aircraft, like the Boeing 737, where the thrust lever indicates engine power. On the A320, the pilots select a general thrust regime using the thrust levers, and the flight computers then determine the exact amount of thrust required to achieve the desired aircraft performance. This means that when the pilots position the thrust levers for different regimes, such as reverse, idle, climb, or takeoff, toga, they're providing the system with the authority to use any amount of thrust up to a programmed limit for each mode. For this approach, both thrust levers were positioned at the climb detent, providing the engines with enough thrust to maintain speed, while the aircraft was fully configured for landing. However, when the thrust reversers are engaged, the system behaves differently. With the engines in reverse thrust mode, the aircraft decelerates, but the power output becomes more directly linked to the position of the thrust lever. As the aircraft descended, the cockpit radio altitude callouts were made. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. The main landing gear settled onto the runway perfectly within the touchdown zone, and the aircraft was traveling at 142 knots. Moments before the wheels touched down, an automated voice called out, "Retard, retard!" prompting the pilots to reduce the engine power to idle. In response, the captain, fully focused on the landing procedure, reached for the thrust levers. Knowing the importance of getting this right, he moved the left thrust lever back to idle and then into reverse, causing the left-hand thrust reverser to deploy immediately. But in the midst of focusing on one lever, he made a critical mistake. A mistake that was not only preventable, but was one of the key issues addressed in the revised landing procedure from Airbus. The captain forgot to move the right thrust lever back to idle, leaving it in the climb detent. This oversight was catastrophic. On the Airbus A320, ground spoilers, crucial for decelerating the aircraft, can only deploy when both thrust levers are positioned at idle or below, and the aircraft's weight is on the wheels. Spoilers work by spoiling the lift from the wings, which helps the aircraft settle onto its landing gear and brakes. If the spoilers fail to deploy, the aircraft remains light on the wheels, reducing the effectiveness of the wheel brakes, which are the primary means of stopping the aircraft. Without ground spoilers, the braking power on the A320 is reduced by up to 50%, making it far more difficult to stop the aircraft efficiently. Normally, when landing, the brakes are automatically armed, allowing them to apply quickly and smoothly after touchdown. However, the brakes on this aircraft wouldn't function properly because the ground spoilers didn't deploy as they should have. The situation worsened when the captain moved the left thrust lever into reverse. This disengaged the outer thrust system, and the right engine's power output became directly tied to the position of the right thrust lever. Since the right lever remained at the climb detent, the right engine continued to produce power at 1.18 EPR, the same setting as during the approach. This caused an imbalance, with the left engine in reverse thrust and the right engine still producing significant forward thrust. Despite the mismatch in thrust, the cockpit's automated call-out stopped once the left thrust lever was in the reverse detent, as if to indicate that everything was normal. This flaw in the warning system stemmed from an earlier set of accidents that revealed the logic of the retard warning was insufficient for such situations. In response, Airbus had developed an update to the flight warning computer that would trigger a master caution alarm and an ECAM, electronic centralized aircraft monitoring, warning if a thrust lever was positioned above idle during landing. But this update was never made mandatory, and tragically, TAM Airlines had failed to implement it in their fleet. So instead of a clear, obvious warning that something was wrong, the pilots received only subtle, indirect indications that there was a serious issue, but nothing directly pointing to the root cause of the problem. The system didn't alert the crew to the mismatch in engine power, nor did it provide the necessary warning to correct the error. As the aircraft touched down, The consequences of the captain's decision to revert to the old landing procedure without considering the full implications of his actions became painfully clear. What had seemed like a small mistake, the failure to move the right thrust lever to idle, had led to a catastrophic failure of the braking system, with the aircraft now unable to stop as it should have. The combination of a malfunctioning thrust reverser, an unresponsive braking system, and the failure of crucial automated warning systems created a perfect storm that would soon push Flight 3054 beyond the point of no return. As Flight 3054 hurtled down the runway, the acting first officer quickly realized that the ground spoilers hadn't deployed, but instead of calling this out immediately, he made a less urgent remark, first confirming the operation of the left thrust reverser, and then muttering "spoilers nada, no spoilers." This lack of urgency in his callouts did not emphasize the critical importance of the missing spoilers. Even if it had, however, there were no immediate memory items or quick procedures for the captain to act on in such a situation. By this point, the captain had clearly noticed that the aircraft wasn't decelerating as expected, but he likely attributed the lack of deceleration to the expected aquaplaning on the wet runway. For the first agonizing 6 seconds, no real manual braking was applied. Afterward, he began applying asymmetrical braking and full right rudder in an attempt to regain control of the aircraft, which was now drifting dangerously to the left. The plane's trajectory was becoming more and more erratic. The captain then applied maximum manual braking, but the effect was minimal. Without the ground spoilers, the wings were still generating lift, causing the tires to skim across the runway surface. When the brakes were applied, the wheels locked due to insufficient friction, and the anti-skid system intervened, relieving brake pressure until the wheels began to roll again. As a result, even the maximum braking effort seemed almost useless. This lack of effective deceleration, combined with the asymmetrical thrust, made the situation more urgent with each passing second. The aircraft continued to veer left, chewing through the available landing distance. The situation was quickly becoming a frantic race against time. Later investigations revealed that if the pilots had recognized the incorrect thrust lever position within the first 7 seconds after the first officer's "spoilers nada" call-out, the aircraft would have likely been able to stop in time. But in a high-stress, high-speed environment like this, 7 seconds can feel like an eternity. So, why didn't the pilots figure out what was happening? The reasons remain unclear, but several factors could have contributed. The cockpit was dark, and the thrust levers on the Airbus A320 are relatively small and not always in the pilot's direct line of sight. More importantly, the Airbus A320's thrust levers don't provide immediate visual feedback regarding engine power like on other aircraft, such as the Boeing 737, where pilots can more easily monitor the engine's power output. This lack of visual confirmation made it harder for the pilots to notice that one thrust lever remained out of position, while the aircraft was struggling to decelerate. Additionally, the captain would have been highly focused on applying maximum braking force, a natural human response in a panic situation. His attention would likely have been consumed with trying to stop the aircraft and regain control, leaving little mental capacity to troubleshoot the issue. It would then have fallen to the acting first officer to identify the problem. However, with only 22 hours on the A320 and rush training, his ability to quickly pinpoint the issue was severely limited. As the aircraft sped down the runway at more than 100 knots, drifting left due to the asymmetrical thrust, the captain struggled to regain control using rudder and brakes. However, as speed decreased, rudder effectiveness also diminished, and the asymmetric thrust overpowered the aircraft's ability to correct. The airplane crossed over the runway edge lights and onto the grass, with the pilots continuing to fight to bring the plane to a halt, but it was too late. The aircraft was now traveling at 96 knots, crossing over the taxiway, and then careening off the left side of the runway. The plane briefly became airborne, clearing a 16-meter high embankment, just narrowly avoiding a major boulevard below. But it couldn't stop in time. It crashed directly into a fuel station and a building housing TAM Airlines express cargo service. The wreckage was consumed by an enormous fuel fire that burned for over 24 hours. Tragically, all 187 passengers and crew on board were killed. The fire also claimed the lives of 12 individuals inside the building struck by the aircraft. This remains the deadliest air disaster in South American history. The final report into the crash highlighted that there was not just one single cause, but a series of contributing factors. The immediate cause of the crash was the captain's failure to move the right thrust lever from the climb detent to idle, which prevented the ground spoilers from deploying and rendered the braking system ineffective. This, combined with the failure to properly recognize and address the situation, led to the tragic crash. However, this single error was not the only reason the crash happened. The report found that the error was made possible by a combination of factors, including intense stress experienced by the captain due to the challenging airport conditions, wet weather, high landing weight, inoperative reversers, and the previous day's accident. Additionally, the airline's organizational culture, the management climate, and the unusual crew composition all played a role. These stresses significantly increased the likelihood of human error occurring. The risks associated with such stress could have been mitigated through better communication and support within the cockpit. We don't know for sure if this was discussed among the crew, but the lack of any formal support or procedures to help deal with such stress contributed to the disaster. Brazil's Accident Investigation Agency issued 82 separate recommendations following the crash. One of the most critical being that Congonhas Airport needed to be upgraded to include proper runway safety areas, even if that meant shortening the runway. The airport's lack of safety margins made even small runway excursions potentially fatal, especially at the busiest airport in Brazil. While ANAC was slow to respond, changes were eventually made. In 2022, runway 35L17R at Congonhas was fitted with enhanced materials arrestor systems, EMAS, at both ends. This system uses a bed of crushable material to quickly stop an aircraft, greatly improving the safety margins and giving pilots more peace of mind when landing at airports like Congonhas or Chicago Midway. This incident serves as a stark reminder of the risks posed by runway excursions, especially as the frequency of such incidents increases, even as other types of aviation accidents decline. The lessons learned from this tragedy are critical for improving aviation safety and reducing the likelihood of similar accidents in the future. Thank you for following this detailed analysis, and consider supporting our work through Patreon, merch, or other means. Your support is greatly appreciated. Stay safe and take care.